afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the Oxford Jurisprudence Discussion Group. This is the final seminar of the year, and we're delighted to be joined tonight by Professor Rebecca Stone from UCLA, who will be presenting her paper, Normative Uncertainty, Normative Powers, and Limits on the Freedom of Contract. Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks so much. I'm just going to share my screen. So hopefully, has that worked? Okay, so I can see it, so I assume you can all see it. So thanks so much for inviting me. It's nice to be there virtually. So this paper arose from my interest in exploitative agreements that seem to be fully voluntary on both sides. So agreements that both parties fully understand and freely enter into, whose terms have nonetheless been affected in some way by background injustice. So when we start to reflect on the moral validity of such agreements, we encounter, I think, a clash of intuitions. So on the one hand, people shouldn't be able to benefit from injustice. On the other hand, so long as the interests of third parties aren't implicated, the fact that an agreement is freely entered into, including by the party who does worse than he would have done under just conditions, seems to make the transaction worthy of our respect, regardless. So, of course, not all theorists would see a deep problem here. So for a consequentialist of the welfarist variety, there isn't a deep problem, because the welfarist cares about voluntariness only instrumentally insofar as it tends to promote, voluntary agreements tend to promote the optimal amount and distribution of utility or welfare. You know, the standard argument here is that people know what is in their interests, and so we should respect what they voluntarily choose. So therefore, for that type of theorist, whether we should respect particular agreements is ultimately an empirical question that's going to depend on the overall effects on the distribution and amount of welfare. But for someone with deontological intuitions, the clash is going to run deeper, because deontologists are inclined to view voluntary agreements as having intrinsic and not merely instrumental significance, and they're also likely to understand justice in rights-based terms, with rights also accorded intrinsic significance. And so then we have this clash. How do we reconcile the claims of substantive justice with this idea that voluntary agreements are worthy of our respect? So I take a deontological approach to the problem, and then the question is, how should a deontologist go about resolving this clash? So the question naturally puts us in the realm of non-ideal theory, because we're assuming background injustice. Despite that fact, I search for an answer in what might seem like an incongruous way by imagining an infeasibly ideal world, namely a world of moral superbeings. So these moral superbeings are perfectly motivated to comply with the demands of reason and justice. They know what reason and justice demands of them. They know all the normatively relevant facts, and although they can't predict the future, they are able to rationally assign probabilities to the possibilities that might materialize. So for the moment, I'm going to also make the additional assumption that the prescriptions of reason and justice are determinate, but later I'm going to relax that assumption. So why do I start with this thought experiment? Two reasons, really. First, although it is an unreachable ideal for us, it is still one that we should plausibly strive towards. So we should try to do what reason and justice demand of us, even if we don't know exactly what those demands are. And second, the thought experiment, it turns out, helps us, I believe, identify when and why moral agents need the powers of consent and promise. So I'm going to soon argue that there won't be a significant role for the normative powers of consent, promise, and agreement under this set of assumptions set out on this slide. And then if I'm right about that, then we may be able to locate a role for these normative powers in the ways in which the world, or we and the world, in fact, depart from these, this superbeing world. So this is the central claim of the paper. Consent and promise, I argue, settle normative uncertainty about the demands of reason and justice, including and especially normative uncertainty of an epistemic kind. So superbeings do not face epistemic normative uncertainty because they know everything. And therefore, there's only a limited role for normative powers in their world. However, for us, more limited beings, navigating the moral landscape is an extremely complicated task, especially when the starting point is one of injustice. And it's the complexity of this task that generates the need for consent and promising. And then once we understand consent and promising, I argue we can also see how we should think about the moral validity of their exercise in non-ideal conditions. So start with consent. So under the assumptions laid out, superbeings have no need for such a power. So why is that? So suppose B is deciding whether or not to take some action that we might ordinarily think A must consent to. So B is thinking about taking some action that involves touching A's body in an intimate way, for example. B, as a superbeing, will be able to see all the reasons for and against touching A in this way, including the reasons that arise from A's desires and interests. These reasons alone should be sufficient to determine how B should act. In fact, if the only reasons that exist are impartial reasons, then B and A will view the normative problem in exactly an identical same way. And so it's straightforward what B should do, no need for authorization by A. So how do reasons of partiality change things? So that's about when there's only impartial reasons. What about partial reasons? So we have partial reasons stemming from our particular relationships, our special concern with our own self-interest. So those types of reasons mean that agents could have different rational views about what a particular person should do in any given situation. So to be a bit more concrete, suppose the question is whether B should save A's child at the expense of several strangers, or vice versa, by, say, snatching a flotation device from A. So reasons of partiality might mean that from A's standpoint, B should save A's child at the expense of others, while from B's standpoint, B should save the others because there's more of them at the expense of A's child. So rational conflicts of this kind complicate the moral landscape, but I don't think that they create an affirmative role for consent. So in the example, I don't think A's act of authorization or otherwise should add anything to B's rational calculus. Why? Because B as a superbeing has already weighed considerations arising from A's and A's child interests in determining what B's standpoint dictates. It's just that B weights them differently from A. So if B's standpoint controls the choice, that is what B should do. She should save the others. But what conflicts do is make it matter whose standpoint controls. So perhaps A's standpoint is the standpoint that should control B's choice, not B's. In that case, B should have to send the flotation device to A's child. So what we do need when we have these reasons of partiality is a mechanism, something that looks a bit like a system of rights that determines whose standpoint should govern when standpoints conflict. So if A's standpoint control, we might say that A has the right to determine what happens to the flotation device. But notice that this right isn't a right to decide. It simply entails that A's rational standpoint the reasons that define A's standpoint governs what must be done to the flotation device rather than B's standpoint. And so I don't think a role for consent emerges from this system of rights. Superbeings are motivated to do as reason and justice demands, and so will always choose in accordance with the governing standpoint. So if A's standpoint governs as a matter of right, B will be required to throw the flotation device to A's child, but it won't depend on A actually authorizing B. B would have to do this even if A irrationally has instructed B not to do so. So what this picture of rights does do is raise a set of normative questions of a distributive nature, because we have to decide how these standpoints of these conflicting standpoints are going to be allocated to choices in accordance with what I take to, so I use justice as the word to describe the correct allocation of standpoints to choices. So exactly what justice requires here is obviously very complex. Presumably considerations of fairness and flourishing are key. Exactly what they're going to entail is going to be very hard to say. But what is important for my purposes is that justice imposes practical constraints on agents' actions that are distinct from those arising from the reasons that define any given agent's standpoint. So we can now see that superbeings won't have a role for promising either. So what do promises and agreements do? So they alter, they're standardly thought to alter parties' rights and duties. So in the terms of this framework, that means reallocating standpoints among choices. We are assuming that superbeings are always perfectly motivated to conform to justice and know what justice demands. Therefore, agreements and promises are not needed. Superbeings have no need to reallocate anything because justice is already supplying the right answer. So this may not be completely obvious. You know, given they can't predict the future, won't they need to enter into agreements to execute joint projects that extend over time? So I don't think so. Because remember, they can imagine all possible future contingencies and they know what reason and justice demands in every possible contingency. Justice is going to have an intertemporal dimension, allocating standpoints to possible decisions over time. But if the allocation is already just, superbeings have no reason to rearrange it by making promises to one another. So just to be more concrete, suppose that A and B and A and B's kids are both going on a boat trip on a boat with 2 life preservers. A and B might enter into an agreement that in the event a life preserver is needed, each will throw the preserver to the child most likely to be saved by it, regardless of what his standpoint would otherwise prescribe. But such an arrangement, it's plausible to suppose, is what justice would already prescribe, and so they would therefore have no need for such an agreement. So if this argument is correct, then normative powers emerge in response to departures from this ideal, and then the question becomes which departure or departures. So I don't think do they arise, does the need for these powers arise from ignorance of morally relevant facts? I don't think so, because uncertainty about relevant facts is itself a kind of fact to which we can rationally respond, as when a doctor prescribes medicine to a sick patient based on her best guess about the cause of a patient's illness. So therefore, we should simply be able to redescribe the world in terms of more complicated facts that would include agents' rational beliefs about what states are going to materialize. What about asymmetric ignorance of morally relevant facts? So I don't think one person's access to facts that the other doesn't have access to creates the needs for normative powers either. So in the absence of conflicts arising from partiality, the better informed agent would willingly share any such information with the less informed agent. When their standpoints conflict, justice, I think, would rule out attempts by one to manipulate the other to conform to his own standpoint by deception or withholding pertinent information, because you could achieve a kind of a reallocation of, de facto reallocation of standpoints that way. That would be ruled out. What if agents cannot accurately represent their own ignorance due to unconscious information processing biases? So we are continuing to assume that they're fully committed to doing what reason and justice requires of them. Therefore, such biases wouldn't be the product of laziness or self-serving motivations. So their beliefs would be as accurate as possible given whatever epistemic constraints they're under. So I don't think this gives rise for a need for normative powers, but it might complicate questions of justice, because justice might need to now assign epistemic standpoints to particular choices, in addition to assigning the standpoints themselves, because there's the potential for conflict. What about the assumption that beings are able to imagine all future possibilities? Again, I don't think that relaxing this assumption generates the need for normative powers. Limited imaginations mean that the allocation of standpoints to choices would necessarily have to be elaborated over time. But being able to make promises isn't going to improve agents' predicament, because the problem here isn't a lack of commitment. It's just that they simply can't imagine what the future might hold. So a promise made in the face of such ignorance doesn't seem any better than an allocation of standpoints made in the face of such ignorance. So it doesn't seem to solve a practical problem that a just system of rights couldn't solve in the same way. Finally, let's relax the assumption that agents are perfectly motivated to comply with the demands of reason and justice. So I think non-compliance by some poses a problem for those who are motivated to comply, but this again complicates questions of justice rather than creating a need for normative powers. You might think that the burdens of this non-compliance need to be distributed justly. We might consider, though, imperfect motivations a milder form of perfect motivations. So the agents recognize the force of the relevant reasons and considerations of justice, but are sometimes tempted to act otherwise. So we might think that promises can serve as an effective self-disciplining device by, say, increasing the strength of certain reasons in such a way as to overcome temptation. So I'm skeptical that promising can do this, because it seems to involve the agent tricking himself, engaging in a charade, manufacturing a fake additional reason to do what she knows that justice and reason already demand of her. Now, of course, she has, in a sense, added a reason by making the promise, but it's a really very strange type of promise, given that its purpose is to overcome a personal weakness rather than do something for the promisee. And assuming the promisee hasn't relied on it, it's unclear why it would really change the rational calculus. Why wouldn't it just correspond? Why wouldn't the weight of the promise just correspond to the weight of the underlying reasons she's trying to conform to? And of course, if the promisee releases her from the promise, it doesn't do its job. So at the very best, it's a blunt instrument for achieving this purpose, which is not to say that the acratic agent might not find it helpful to deliberate in advance and form an intention about what she's going to do as a mechanism for overcoming temptation. But that doesn't involve the transfer of authority to anyone else. So none of these departures, I think, give rise to the need for these powers. So what departures do give a rise for a role for normative powers? So the answer, I believe, is normative uncertainty about what reason demands from any agent's standpoint, and normative uncertainty about justice. So on my conception, promising and consent don't alter the landscape at the fundamental moral level. They don't mysteriously generate new reasons where there were none before. What they do is they settle normative uncertainty. Normative uncertainty may have metaphysical or epistemic sources. a practical problem is indeterminate in the metaphysical sense when there is just no right answer, at least prior to one being selected by an appropriate decision procedure. It's indeterminate in the epistemic sense when it's hard to figure out the right answer, even assuming that there is a right answer. So the first type of indeterminacy is one that even superbeings are going to have to contend with. More limited beings are going to have to contend with both types of normative uncertainty and interactions between the two. So once we get to once we introduce normative uncertainty, and we need to go back to what we understand by rights, because normative uncertainty adds an additional dimension to rights. So remember, in the determinate world, justice assigns standpoints to possible choices, thus resolving these potential conflicts among standpoints. But once we introduce normative uncertainty, we've got to face the question of who has the authority to resolve it. So the system of rights is also going to have to tell us who is authorized to resolve relevant normative uncertainty. So I make the assumption here that for instrumental, but more importantly, intrinsic reasons, authority to settle normative uncertainty about standpoints is assigned to the right holder. This usually will make sense from an instrumental standpoint, insofar as the right holder is better positioned to know what his standpoint dictates. But I think the more important considerations here are intrinsic. Assigning decision-making authority to the right holder instantiates principles of autonomy and equal respect for persons. Then when it comes to normative uncertainty about justice, I assume that authority to settle normative uncertainty about justice is assigned to the group of right holders whose rights are implicated by plausible resolutions of the normative uncertainty for analogous intrinsic reasons. So at this point, a meaningful role for consent arises. So agents are going to need the power to settle what their standpoint requires in the face of normative uncertainty. And given that one agent's standpoint may sometimes govern what other agents may do, agents must therefore sometimes have the power to settle normative uncertainty about what others may do. And so this is how I understand consent. Consent involves settling normative uncertainty about what another may do in domains that are governed by the consenting agent's standpoint. So what is settling going to entail? So it's going to involve more than simply acting on one's best assessment of the demands of reason, at least so far as the uncertainty is epistemic, because deliberating more might always improve the assessment. So agents therefore always face a second order question: what is the optimal amount of deliberation? But of course, the answer to that question is also going to be normatively uncertain, because it's going to depend on the nature of the underlying problem, which is uncertain. And so then there would be a regress, third order question about the best answer to the second order question, and so forth. And so the upshot is going to be that settling is going to involve a decision to stop deliberating, the rationality of which isn't going to be reducible to any of the underlying reasons that the agent is attempting to balance. But I don't think this means anything goes. An act of consent must constitute a plausible resolution of the normative uncertainty in order to be morally valid. So an attempt by A to consent to an action by B that is manifestly against A's interests with no possible moral justification, like B's gratuitous torture of A, would be invalid on this account. There's basically substantive limits on what A may authorize B to do to her, because the power of consent on this view is not the power to authorize the irrational, but rather to settle uncertainty about what reason requires. So what about promising? You might think that just mere normative uncertainty about what reason demands from a particular agent's standpoint gives rise to a role for promising. Agents faced with such standpoint uncertainty are going to have to resolve, who want to engage in joint projects are going to have to resolve that uncertainty in a coordinated fashion in order to coordinate successfully. But I don't think that this creates the need for an actual reallocation of rights. It seems that joint decision making would probably suffice because so joint decision making here would mean settling in advance what each would do pursuant to a joint plan. There would be no transfer of authority, but there would be a lot of moral glue created by the fact that both parties had participated in the creation of the plan and had relied on it in various ways. So I don't think promising gets going until we have normative uncertainty about justice, no normative uncertainty about the correct allocation of standpoint to choices. So that type of normative uncertainty creates the need for powers to settle uncertainty about what rights people have, just as normative uncertainty about what reason demands from a given standpoint generates the need for powers of decision making and consent. So on this view of promising, the settlement account promises don't actually transfer rights. They instead perform a settling function, fixing the contours of what I think of as agents' morally valid legal rights. So they are allocations of decision-making authority that agents have by virtue of prior valid attempts by the relevant community to settle what rights people have. So there's a kind of parallel with transfer accounts of promising here, because insofar as agents' legal rights change as a result of promising, promising does transfer legal rights, but at the deepest moral level, nothing changes. So the underlying moral rights, if we understand them as assignments of standpoints to choices, are unaffected. And so for this reason, there's substantive constraints on what counts as a morally valid promise or agreement, because it must constitute a plausible settlement of the normative uncertainty about justice. And so therefore, it's also going to follow that some things are just not possible to make valid promises about. If no plausible theory of justice would give authority over these matters to anyone other than that of the agent, then the agent can transfer authority. So an attempt to sell oneself into slavery would probably be invalid. And even more mundane promises might be invalid too. So you might think promises to have sex with someone else, so really intimate decisions like that, might be invalid under ordinary circumstances. So that would follow if no plausible theory of justice would give D the authority to decide whether C will have sex with D in ordinary circumstances. And so if this is right, then while C could consent to sex with D in the moment, she couldn't make a promise. She would always have the right to stop having sex or change her mind by withdrawing that consent, because the promise would be ineffective. So then, how does this framework enable us to get the question on the a handle on the question posed out of the paper about how background injustice affects the validity of the exercise of normative powers? So start with consent. So here, let's suppose the injustice is that sexual harassment is serious and widespread. So the framework suggests that in the ideal world, where this is not the case, sex would be morally permissible whenever both parties consent by settling relevant normative uncertainty about what their partners may do to their bodies, and each knows how the other has settled that uncertainty. So there would be no requirement or no obvious need for that those settlements to be expressly communicated, say, unless perhaps that was the only way of figuring out what the other had determined. But the framework at the same time can help explain why more may be needed under these non-ideal conditions of widespread assault and harassment. So suppose that a rule requiring everyone to seek express authorization before having sex with another significantly reduces the amount of abuse and harassment, then it's possible that non-ideal justice might impose such a requirement. Why? Because the rule benefits victims of harassment by reducing infringements of their rights while imposing a relatively small cost on everyone else in the form of a small barrier to engaging in morally unproblematic sex. So in this way, the rule plausibly spreads the burdens of non-compliance more equitably and justly. So formally, the effect of such a rule would be to make it the case that no one's standpoint controls certain choices to engage in sex in the absence of express authorization by the person whose standpoint would otherwise control. And so you might think that the way we should think about the effect of breaking the rule is that it entails a kind of wrong against the community of people who are potential victims of harassment, rather than a wrong against one's partner, assuming that the partner would settle normative uncertainty to allow for sex. So that's how we might think about some non-ideal justice in the context of consent. And then what about the non-ideal agreements? What about how does the framework handle the question of exploitative agreements? How does injustice in the background legal distribution of rights threaten the validity of promises and agreements that take unjust legal entitlements as their starting point? So there's kind of two ways we might think about the effects of background injustice here. So one way agreements may be invalid is when the parties to the agreement transparently lack the moral authority to control the choices that are the subject of the agreement. So imagine two very, very unjustly enriched rich people forming an agreement to use their excessive resources to further enrich themselves. Such an agreement may be invalid on this account because they don't have the authority to control those resources in the first place. Of course, the rich people might respond, oh, well, this is the fault of the collective, not our fault. There's a limited amount we can do to solve the background problem of distributive injustice. So maybe they can say, oh, well, the agreement is morally valid between ourselves, even though it's not morally valid vis-a-vis the rest of the community, something like that. I think the rich parties can potentially say this, but only when there's really nothing that they could have done to respond to the injustice. So even when a problem of distributive injustice is in large part attributable to a collective action problem, it's probably not the case that the rich people could have done nothing to alleviate it through their agreement. So they might choose a different contracting partner, for example, transacting with a poorer person rather than each other, thus ensuring that poorer people get a share of this surplus. So if such alternative arrangements are available, the account suggests they may have to pursue them for their agreements to be morally valid. And it might still be the case that we want to say that such agreements lack full-fledged moral validity vis-a-vis third parties because they're premised on unjust legal entitlements, but they plausibly would have moral validity between the parties to the contract. And the second way that background injustice can, so that's just repeating those 2 points. So the other way that background injustice can matter is we don't assume that the parties are unjustly rich, but that background injustice somehow distorts the terms of the agreements that they make with one another. So it would be, I think, implausible to suppose that simply showing that background injustice has affected the terms of a contract in some way renders it morally invalid, because that would probably mean every single contract that we ever enter into is morally invalid, given the myriad ways in which the distribution will affect the terms of trade. What the account here, so agreements need not perfectly realize justice to be morally valid, precisely because we are operating in this world of epistemic normative uncertainty. But what they must constitute plausible determinations of what non-ideal justice requires. So they must be set in a way that does not transparently take advantage of injustice. So for example, price gouging in the face of a natural disaster where the community is just abdicating its responsibilities to look after the victims would presumably be ruled out. But yeah, as I say, agreements need not be perfectly just to be morally valid. They simply have to constitute plausible settlements of the applicable normative uncertainty that is created by the background injustice. So that brings me to the end, just to recap. So I've developed an account of the normative powers of consent and promising, which I call the settlement account, according to which they are constitutively responses to normative uncertainty. So acts of consent resolve uncertainty about what reason demands from the right holding agent's standpoint. Acts of promising resolve uncertainty about what justice demands, about who has authority to decide a particular question. Exercises of such powers are therefore valid only if they constitute plausible resolutions of the normative uncertainty, which means that there's intrinsic value to freedom of choice, but that also that freedom is substantively constrained. So therefore, a transparently exploitative contract would be invalid, despite having been freely entered into, but a contract in which a poorer party is dealt with on generous terms by a richer party may well not be, even if the poor party would never have entered into such an agreement under just conditions. So I will stop there and look forward to your questions.